at the start.
That's fair enough.
This is
when you're on stage, you don't get the benefit of that either, so you learn how to make it work.
Correct. And as you might have gleaned from my questions, I'd like to take another tack, another course at Biomimicry with your indulgence.
Sure.
So let's dive in.
Okay.
The first question is, how are we teaching our kids to understand biomimicry these days?
Well, in a very sort of technical fashion, we have a number of programs that we're working on around the K through 12 sector for biomimicry. Some are in the formal realm and some are in the informal realm. So we actually have a gentleman by the name of Sam Steer who runs our K through 12 education program. And he's primarily working with educators so that they have the tools that they need to take it out. So there's online curricula sharing where teachers are sharing their best practices. Sam actually has produced an online course for teachers to take in order to learn how to best teach biomimicry. And then we have a couple of other sort of complementary resources or supplementary resources in the sense of we have a children's CD that's got amazing, amazing music. It's called Ask the Planet. And the songs are just perfect for kids. Amy Martin was the recorder, writer, producer of that and singer-songwriter. And the Missoula Children's Coyote Choir sings a lot of the songs. And what's really cool about that is that there's an accompanying curricula. So you can get online if you're a teacher. You can use the songs and use the curricula to help teach biomimicry. And then we have a number of sort of exhibit initiatives where we work with exhibits to help them incorporate biomimicry either as a special exhibit or within existing exhibits at like natural history museums and zoos and science centers.
Do you feel that biomimicry is a fringe science or a core science now?
Well, I would actually call biomimicry a science. It's grounded in science in the sense that there's a very important critical part of it, which is understanding the way the natural world works, but it's much more interdisciplinary than that. So it's really an art and a science, and it is the blending of the two of those and in an interdisciplinary fashion that results in amazing sort of emulations from the natural world. So it's not a core science in that you can expect to find it in every science curricula at every university. And I wouldn't call it a fringe science in the sense of, it's not, we take a great deal of respect for the scientific integrity around what biomimicry is about, and that it's not just randomly pulling abstract ideas from nature that you really don't have any scientific grounding in and pretending that we can emulate them. So there's very much a lot of scientific integrity within it. And you see more and more scientific conferences that have breakout sessions or panels or even there's whole conferences now devoted to learning from nature that are primarily attended by scientists. So I would say it's trending in the direction of becoming a more established practice or discipline of which science has an influence.
Well, great. Let's get back to the art part of that in a moment. But can you talk about if there are language and cultural-based biases that are in play as we look at nature?
Bias is kind of an odd word in that sense. I think that there are some language and some cultures where our connection to nature is more implicit. It's more embedded within the sort of underlying cultural paradigms, and others where we've kind of gone out of our way to draw a separation between humans and nature, namely the Western-dominated culture has that trend.
Yeah.
So it becomes a little bit harder, even for me, a native English speaker, it's often easy to fall in the trap of saying, well, nature out there and we're in here, sort of creating that artificial separation. Whereas, we've done some work in India and a good portion of the Indian culture has a stronger tie, even from a spirituality perspective, to a naturalistic kind of, or even the pantheistic approach has more of a naturalism within that. And so it's a little easier to make that connection. And of course, if you look at many of the indigenous cultures, that tie is even stronger. But what I love about biomimicry is that it is actually incredibly universal. It gets to the core of who we are as a species, and that sort of natural attraction to nature, independent of your culture, your language, your gender, your race, your creed, whatever. Everybody kind of goes, yeah, you know, that's not a bad idea for us to look to nature.
Excellent. Tell me what you mean by creating a new ethos for leadership and design.
Well, when we talk about biomimicry, we talk about 3 seeds of biomimicry. And these seeds are sort of the core elements that come together to create and inform the practice of biomimicry. One is the ethos. Another is the reconnect, and the last is to emulate. So the emulate is sort of the classic that we all understand. You look to nature, you find an inspiration, you emulate that idea, and something comes out. Okay. But the other 2 pieces are very important. So one is the reconnect, where you're very much rebuilding those bonds that we just talked about, that nature and humans are one. And it's finding the naturalist in all of us and really beginning to understand and become in tune with place. That's a critical component of practicing biomimicry. The last is the ethic, the sort of the purpose and the reason why you're looking to nature for inspiration. You know, we definitely have folks that are purely interested in the innovation side of things, but innovation for innovation's sake without, you know, trying to solve some of the world's challenges, really helping humans learn to fit in on the planet again is sort of the underlying ethic that we bring forth with biomimicry. And we believe it's what sort of separates biomimicry from what's sort of classically bio-inspired. So when we say creating a new ethos for leadership and design, we're really talking about bringing that ethic of sort of what's worth doing and why to the field of leadership and design. And really looking to nature helps us sort of begin to answer those questions of what is worth doing.
So you're a private corporation, for-profit, correct?
We have a for-profit and a non-profit arm. So we have 2 organizations that we consider sister organizations that work together to achieve the work that we do.
Okay, interesting. Also, something that jumped out at me was what you call genius of place. Yeah. And it sounds strikingly familiar to something in permaculture called assessment. Mm-hmm. Why don't you tie together permaculture and biomimicry for me, if you could? Sure. What's going on between those 2 things?
Well, you know, when I look at permaculture at its both purest and most comprehensive form, there's an incredible amount of overlap between biomimicry and permaculture. We often use permaculture as an example of biomimicry, as a very comprehensive example. A lot of people, unfortunately, think of permaculture limited to just the agriculture side of things. Right. And don't necessarily expand it out into, you know, how we build our communities, how we relate to each other. And when you get into that sort of broader realm, that's really where biomimicry is also playing in those spaces. But, you know, we fall trapped to the same thing. It's much easier to explain the garden design, just as it's much easier to explain a product design than it is to explain the more conceptual relationships around, you know, the principles that guide healthy communities. Especially in a news article or even in a quick PowerPoint presentation.
Sure.
So I think there's actually an incredible amount of overlap. If anything, I would say that biomimicry, even in the genius of place, takes it a little bit deeper than metaphor. And permaculture isn't purely metaphorical. A lot of it is shape and pattern and design and relationships.
Yes.
And biomimicry, if you look at sort of a gradient, I think there's definitely a lot of overlap. And then biomimicry has a little bit more of a weighting in the heavier end, or has a heavier end where there's no assumptions placed on any of that. But in the the actual what is happening at the electron microscope level, and is there something that we can learn from that and apply it to material design? And so in some ways biomimicry becomes less accessible to sort of quote the everyday backyard gardener, if you will, because it is more technical in nature. Maybe that's one way to think of it. Whereas permaculture is a little bit more accessible, being more conceptual in nature. But there's quite a bit of overlap, I think.
Interesting. Okay. Well, one of my core interests is promoting the sacred, and I'm running a course called sacredpermaculture.net.
Oh,
I wanted to know what you thought, what you think is sacred to you today.
Well, as a trained biologist, it's a little bit like asking me what's my favorite critter. I mean, if I name one thing sacred, it somehow excludes something else.
Well, go for a larger swath.
Really, I would say life. I mean, life is sacred, and really for us, we talk about unencumbered evolution. And I think if I were to hold that as sort of the master vision of the work we do, is to create a space in which humans can exist on this planet without encumbering evolution, and allowing evolution to proceed as it's been proceeding for the last 3.85 billion years as a process that selects for that which is most well adapted.
So evolution is a sacred process to you? Is that right?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, evolution is, it will always proceed no matter what, whether or not, how we mess with it and affect its ability to achieve or to have the emergent property of ever more fittedness for any given time is a space that I think we need to be very cautious about. And so when I think of sacred, it's like, what do you not mess with? And so yeah, I would say evolution is probably one of those things we shouldn't be messing with.
Very good, thank you. What is a fractal? And do you have favorite fractals?
Well, I mean, fractals are everywhere in the natural world. It's, it's a pattern that's repeated at multiple scales, and both spatially and temporally. I think, again, I'm such a poor person to ask about favorites, because I could name one and then I get, think about something else. But, I mean, classic examples, I always talk about, if you look at leaf veins are a really great way of beginning to see fractals, and then you step back and you see branches, and then you see larger branches, and then you see trunks, and then you see a forest. And, that's sort of a very, very easy way to imagine that. But I don't know if I have a favorite within that realm. I think it's a fascinating space.
Well said. That's sort of a politician talking, huh?
Yeah, well, I'm a biologist. I'm a representative of my constituents, which are the biological world. How dare I choose one over another?
Yes, indeed. Well, I came up with sort of a wild hair here. I'll try it on you. Is biomimicry an example of reverse anthropomorphism? Have you ever heard that question before?
No.
Good. All right, good luck.
But maybe expand on it a little bit, how you're framing that then.
Well, I quickly came to the conclusion that we're using or utilizing nature's pattern, perhaps, in industry and art, perhaps. And what if the reverse was true? And let me see if I can figure out why I asked this question here quickly. Reversing nature. Oh, you know what? I don't know where this question came from. It's too weird.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that we talk about in order to ask nature for inspiration is building a bridge.
Right.
And the bridge that we talk about is at the functional level. So what is it that we're trying to do, and what is it that nature's trying to do, and how can we bring the two of those together? So, for example, we might say, I don't want this toxic red paint, but what are we really trying to do is to convey danger. That's often why we use bright red paint. So we should ask the natural world, well, how do you convey danger? And we find out that we're really trying to do the same thing, that there are organisms in nature that need to convey a warning, and we're trying to convey a warning. And that, once we've had that bridge, then we can begin to find that inspiration. So in a way, anthropomorphizing nature helps us begin to make that bridge. Oh, look, it's caring for its young, or whatever it might be. And we tend to use language that allows us to relate to nature. And so in a way you could say that it's a relating to, and it's finding that bridge that either anthropomorphism or species pomorphism, I don't know what the word might be, ultimately allows us to achieve. And so anthropomorphism in its sense that it degrades the quality of science and hinders our ability to see what's really going on is not good. The fact that it helps us create a stronger bridge and reminds us that we are nature and nature is us, I think has some real important value. So that doesn't directly answer your question, but at least it speaks to that general idea.
That's cool. Yeah, I probably jumped off the cliff on that one. I'll come back. So I'm also interested in writing new mythology in brief, because I think that the old classical myths are no longer active and important to us, and we need new mythology, new stories. So I came up with a question about how can we utilize biomimicry to create things like symbol, song, poems, mythology for what I'm calling the Permaculture Age. Have you seen people utilize it that way?
Definitely. And, we talk about biomimicry as an emerging discipline with an ancient practice.
Ooh, nice.
So there's a very big part of it that is a remembering. And while the classic mythology that comes out of Greco-Roman space was there to tell us a certain story about the way of being on the planet, there's quite a bit of mythology that never really sort of hit mainstream, if you will, that is quite old, that if you really look at it now, you'll actually see biomimicry and permaculture written all over it. Because those stories are ultimately around learning from your ancestors, learning from the locals, learning from the natives, and in many of those indigenous cultural stories, of course, those ancestors and natives are not human. And that sort of wisdom that came from, hey, we're not the only ones here, we better figure out how these others are figuring the ways of being, or have learned the ways of being in this place, is very much old part of who we are as a species. So while we need to update those stories, we also need to remember the stories that have already been written and perhaps cast a new lens and a new light on them. What I find really appealing around biomimicry, I mentioned the universality around it. It also, because of those three seeds, provides an entry from someone who wouldn't necessarily pick up a myth and read that story. But nevertheless, they're totally fascinated by the way a gecko sticks to the wall, and they're fantasizing about having their own kind of tape that does the same thing. And so if their first entry point is into that innovation space, they're talking tech, and they're geeking out on the material science of things.
Okay.
And then you say, well, let me tell you a little bit more about the gecko, and hey, you want to see a gecko in the field? And they're like, oh yeah, cool. And pretty soon you're out in the field with them and you're crawling around in the dirt, and they fall in love with the place, and then suddenly they have a reason for protecting that place. And so it becomes sort of their own story, but it gives them a connection. And so for us, one of the stories that we write is the biomimicry story, and we tell it in a way that reaches an audience that might not otherwise be reached by these important parts of Seed and Reconnect.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So you're developing a mythology of biomimicry then?
In a way, it depends on how you frame it. What's interesting to me is when I give a lecture, I bring in those three seeds in many different ways. So both in my language, in the stories that I tell, and in the photographs and in the actual representation of what I'm doing on the stage.
Right.
And so you'll have people in the audience that see that as a mythology and see that as an incredible story that they're so engaged in from one perspective, from one lens, that they see it as a spiritual path, and then others will see it as like the solution to next year's, innovation forum, and then others who see it as a reminder of their youth and their connection with nature. So they all sort of find a way, but it taps in into a lot of different neurons for a lot of people.
Interesting. Dayna, let's look at one final thing, which is this graphic I sent to you. It's entitled "In the Center of the Cloud,"
Mm-hmm.
and I'm trying to get at a sort of a macro transitional strategy for culture and placing certain groups, I guess you'd say, in some pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to get your feedback because I'm putting permaculture in the center of this process, and obviously I've placed biomimicry in the sacred sector, and obviously there's other things going on here. But what is your immediate overall impression of this diagram?
Well, we play with a lot of building structural relationships and trying to capture what relationships are in a very complex world. So I've had training in systems thinking, and I teach systems thinking. And ultimately what you're portraying up there is some form of a system. And once you place items in space in a complex system, there's always opportunity to discuss the value of them here or there, or why are they not here and why not, and whether or not there's hierarchy, and so it's really a challenge that we've had. We have a set of principles we call life's principles, and I actually heard a lecture. I wish I'd have to look it up, by one of sort of the gurus in permaculture, and she went through sort of the guiding principles in permaculture, and as she laid them out, I realized there was a great number of them that had parallels with the life's principles. And what the life principles are is, not what does one organism do, but what do all 30 million organisms have in common? What is it that has allowed them to fit in? And should those not become sort of the guiding rules for living on this planet for all species, ourselves included? And so we sort of hold those at the core center of everything. And, as I look at your drawing, I would say that, we've seen examples of biomimicry applied to governance. We've seen biomimicry applied to intentional communities. We've seen biomimicry applied to commerce, to green tech, to sustainability tools, to green building, to integrative design, to, so where does one draw the line? And I think there is a little bit of a risk of isolating in pods that it forgets us how much how much of these things do connect. That being said, a lot of people don't see complex systems very well, and the more we can find ways to illustrate them or experience them in such a way that people do see the linkages and the relationships rather than the separations, moves us in the direction that I think we need to be trending for sure.
So, Professor, help me with this. Is this an example of connectedness or integratedness?
Well,
or is it just foolishness?
It has to be both, you know. I mean, in our life's principles, we have a phrase that says all of life is interconnected and interdependent, and that those are emergent properties. They're not designed-in properties. They're emergent properties, and they emerged because it meant greater success for all organisms that sort of interconnected and became interdependent, you know, because you can't do it alone. And so that emergent property is true of all of these things. And you know, our big brains can't really process all this complexity, and the only way we can make sense of it is when we compartmentalize. But the more we do so, the more we move ourselves away from things like the permaculture values and principles. And so it doesn't make it easy to fit all of that in a two-dimensional diagram on a screen, but that's kind of where we ultimately need to trend.
Interesting. So can we think linearly and think biomimicry? Or can't we? And my question is, do we have to throw out these sorts of two-dimensional diagrams? What's to replace it?
No, I don't think we do, but we have to, one, find a way to make sure that we convey what we want to convey and not convey what we don't want to convey, right?
Okay.
Which is often the baggage in a lot of diagrams. And the reason why I sort of speak to this so passionately is our life's principles diagram, which is, you know, again, it's all how all of life works, and how in the world do you draw the connections between these, and how do you put them in some sort of hierarchy. You know, we've had 8 different evolutions of this diagram, and we've made it very clear to people who learn from us that you can be darn sure this diagram will continue to evolve. And so part of the story behind the diagram is this is not fixed in stone. This is merely a tool by which we can begin to have a conversation, and let's play with the parts.
Very good. Thank you. That's my reason to do it as well.
Great. Great.
Hopefully it'll evolve this afternoon.
It will. It's going to have to. I mean, that's the way the world works.
Well, I'll look forward to meeting you at the Pioneers conference in October. That's exactly why I'm here today, is to help promote you and your work and the Pioneers. Great. I'll have this up on YouTube and throughout my network shortly. I appreciate your time, Doctor.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to going to California.
All right. Okay. Have a good day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.